Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Frick. I'm leading the climate diplomacy program of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. We are very happy to have you for this last session of the day, in which we will look into politics and policy, or broadly speaking, into the question of how to make change happen. We learned from the previous session that for a consumer, it's not about what the consumer needs, but what the consumer wants. So how do we translate that into political terms? How do we make people in politics want the right thing? One part certainly is that over the last 20 years, we understood, or we start to understand, that climate issues are not just an issue for the Ministry of Environment. We need an all-of-government approach, and I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, who I believe is uniquely positioned to speak about foreign policy in a conference on health, because a medical doctor by training, Dr. Hinrich Thölken, is the head of the division of the German Foreign Ministry's Department for Climate Change and Environmental Policy. And without much ado, I would like to give the floor to Hinrich to address us on the issue on foreign policy and climate change.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, I'm not only a medical doctor, but I also received part of my clinical training here in London, so I'm quite happy to be back and speak to familiar circles. This conference has a very wide scope: climate change, health risks, and security threats. Therefore, I believe today we have a very diverse audience which reflects the vastness of the issues at stake. And I believe this is good because we have apparently managed to get the subject out of the inner circles of environmental experts and scientists. Climate is the sum of some physical factors that largely make up our environment in which we live, in which we work, and on which we depend for our livelihood. Therefore, if there's any topic that requires a holistic approach, it is certainly the question of climate change. And I would like to give you two arguments why I believe that foreign policy needs to play a major role when it comes to climate change. My first point is, why is a changing climate a problem? As we travel through the world, as I did this morning, we may find that boarding a plane on a bleak and rainy day in Central Europe and getting off the plane in a sunny Mediterranean island may represent a major change in our personal climate, but it's not a problem to us. Actually, we quite enjoy a more pleasant climate. Ladies and gentlemen, but if we say that the world is changing, we are not referring to the world as changing in its physical conditions. In reality, most changes that have occurred so far only apply to social, economical, political, and other man-made categories. And whatever revolution peoples and societies undertook, they knew that the physical environment would remain stable. With the onset of climate change, for the first time in modern human history, our physical environment is no longer stable, but is set to change. And I believe the problem is not only a different climate that we will have tomorrow, but the change management that seems to be beyond our capacities, at least for today. The rules that we have set ourselves for peaceful coexistence on an ever more crowded planet rest upon the assumption that the environment remains stable. Geographical borders, watercourses, coastal lines have been taken as given factors, and this seems to be no longer true. Climate change therefore requires us to rethink some basic principles of geopolitical importance. We may need new rules concerning the law of the sea, concerning natural resources of global importance, that take into account that our physical environment is no longer stable. We may have to rethink borders of national sovereignty. Climate change is a global issue that knows no borders, but is the result of decisions taken at a national level. Adapting our geopolitics to a changing environment is therefore a task for foreign policy, with the aim to reaching at a successful global change management. My second point is, we know that in human history, conflicts have often arisen about access to resources and territories. Climate change will have effects in both areas. Increasingly, we will have a shortage of vital resources such as fresh water and food, but also clean energy. And on the other hand, sea level rise and increased frequency of extreme weather events will render whole stretches of territory uninhabitable or no longer economically available, or will simply make disappear low-lying coastal areas and islands. And as just stated, our system relies on a stable environment. Therefore, we have no rule in place that clarifies what will happen to exclusive economic zones of islands and territories that have sunk into the sea. There have been many instances when arguments about single rocks or sandbanks in the ocean have erupted. So there's any chance that the disappearance of such territories may also lead to tensions and conflicts. Borders following coastlines, riverbeds, river deltas, and so forth will start shifting. Loss of territory may trigger migration and exacerbate tension. We are, as of today, not prepared to deal with such problems. It requires a preventive and far-sighted foreign policy to design procedures and rules that give answers to these questions. Ladies and gentlemen, as this session is about policies and politics, let me formulate 3 suggestions where we could take action as foreign policy experts and we already have tried to start to lay some foundations. The first suggestion is engage high-level foreign policy fora. When in 2007 the UK took the initiative to bring the topic of climate change to the Security Council, it was faced with strong opposition. A debate was possible, but no written statement could be agreed upon. Together with our British friends, we took the initiative of reintroducing the subject to the Security Council in July this year. And we could refer to a campaign that we did for our seat in the Security Council, where we already announced that climate change would be one of our major topics for our time on the Security Council. So when on the July 20, the debate was finally taking place, for the first time ever, a presidential statement was accepted by consensus in the Security Council, stating that climate change poses a threat to peace and security. And the Security Council, the Secretary General, was asked to include the subject of climate change in its report to the Security Council. But on the way to this result, we strongly felt that not all UN members, not all Security Council members, seemed to agree on the fundamental importance of climate change as a risk to peace and stability. And I can assure you, negotiations for the presidential statement were quite tough. The resistance came either from the argument that introducing climate change to the Security Council would represent a kind of encroachment to introduce a subject that is not original to the Security Council, and others held against us that the Security Council could take away the topic of climate change from the UNFCCC negotiations. What we found interesting is that the G77 as a group opposed discussion of climate change within the Security Council, but many G77 members themselves strongly supported our initiative and even congratulated after the debate for the successful outcome of the debate. But rethinking the way how we handle climate change is also necessary within Europe and the European Union. So far, climate change on a European level has been mainly a domain for environment ministers. Foreign ministers were only occasionally involved. With the creation of the External Action Service, no momentum had come to the European Union, so in a joint initiative, the United Kingdom and Germany introduced the topic to the Foreign Affairs Council in July this year, and this resulted in the adoption of Council conclusions that raised the attention of foreign ministers to the diplomatic challenges included by climate change. My second suggestion is we should try hard and make politicians understand what the dimension of the challenge lying ahead of us actually is. Successful climate policy means we have to transform the world economy into a low-carbon energy production, find low-carbon transport solutions, and also find ways for a low carbon and low greenhouse gas food production. The resources of fossil fuels known today can only be exploited to a very limited extent, as they would produce a carbon load that by far exceeds acceptable climate change limits. Basically, peak oil as such is no longer a relevant issue, but rather peak CO2 emissions is what we should look at. If all known resources of fossil fuels were to be exploited and burned, this would lead to 100 times more CO2 emissions as we can allow ourselves to stay within the borders of 2 degrees. In other words, more than 90% of all known oil, gas, and coal reserves have to stay where they are in the soil. Imagine what this means to economies dependent on producing and selling fossil fuels. To believe that such a shift in geopolitical paradigms could take place without causing major disturbances of international relations is naive. Therefore, we are trying to reach a new balance of interests. We need to find a balance of interests between industrialized countries and developing countries, between exporters and importers of fossil fuels, between technologically advanced and less sophisticated economies, between vulnerable and more robust regions. Climate change is a global factor with massive economic, legal, energetic, and financial implications, and as such it will be one of the key determining factors of international relations. The saying that climate negotiations are nothing less than global economic conferences aiming at redistributing resources is gaining more and more credibility. Climate change may easily become the 21st century's biggest foreign policy challenge, comparable in its dimension with the challenge of the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century. Climate change is a danger to human rights. It may cut off millions of men, women, and children from food and drinking water. Without these resources, the right to life is in danger. Climate change, in the end, can do just as much harm as tanks and guns. My third suggestion is talk to the public and listen to the public. We, and this means politicians and government representatives, need to tell people out there that climate change is not a topic for scientists and experts only, but a subject for everybody. Yes, it is a difficult subject, but yes, the people out there have the right and the capacity to know what it is at stake and what choices they have. And I carefully listened to the expression that we heard earlier today about scientific literacy. I fully agree there is a need to raise the level of scientific literacy with our politicians, but this is something that is taking place. At least this is my impression from working from inside the government. But we should also use our dialogue with the public to talk about choices. Our experience in Germany shows us that consumers are willing to make a choice for the environment and for the protection of the climate. For example, many people have opted for electricity that is produced by renewable energy sources, for food that is produced in an ecologically sound way, for energy-saving bulbs, and so on. Having a positive ecological label allows to market products at a higher price, and consumers seem to be willing to pay for them. So giving people a choice and at the same time providing ample information is a key to the necessary transformation of our economy. To conclude, I believe we have enormous challenges ahead of us, but they are not insurmountable. In Europe, we are uniquely placed to play a pivotal role in the international climate diplomacy, and the decisions we take will be central in determining how others act. National foreign services have demonstrated an ability to show leadership and engage in broker agreement in some of the most challenging issues. They can and should be a major force in action in addressing the threats posed by climate change to security and growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hinrich, for drawing a broad picture on foreign policy and climate issues. When it's really about the basis of our prosperity and security, climate diplomacy is so much more than just the involvement in the UNFCCC process. You mentioned that we have to convince our politicians in order to do the right thing, and we have to translate, I think, our thinking into a political narrative that enables us to prepare the choices that people need to do. and Tom Burke is going to talk to us about this. Tom is an environmental policy advisor at Rio Tinto and also a visiting professor at Imperial and University Colleges London. Tom certainly is also one of the founders of E3G, where I have the pleasure to work. Tom, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. And actually also to the organizers for taking the initiative to organize this conference. Like many others professionally involved in climate policy, I spend a lot of time at conferences with familiar faces, saying familiar things. That can be very reassuring, but I'm not sure it gets us very far. As I will go on to argue, finding the necessary political will to act is the biggest challenge facing climate policy. If we're going to meet that challenge successfully, the climate conversation has to involve everybody from all of the professions and all walks of life. Political will is built in the base of society. It's not something you can manufacture in the headlines or leave to those politicians we increasingly distrust. And our analysis of the climate problem is unusually clear. We know exactly what we need to do to solve it: construct a carbon-neutral global energy system by the middle of the century. We know how to do that. All of the technologies and engineering knowledge we need to get there by that time are already available. We know we can afford to do it. The International Energy Agency estimated last year that the net cost of doing so might only add a couple of $2 trillion to the several $1 trillion we will be spending in investing in energy anyway in the next 25 years. That amounts to some tens of billions a year over that period. I used to think that was a lot of money, and then I ran into the bankers. What we do not know is how to put the technology and capital together in a timely manner. And it's doing that that is going to require political will. Political will is built by making clear the connection between what is happening to the climate and all the other interests and preoccupations that concern us all in our daily lives. And health and security are two of the most important of those preoccupations. One of the bigger barriers to building the necessary political will is the tendency of the climate conversation to fall much too quickly into the elephant trap of mind-numbing detail and impenetrable acronyms. Far too often, the climate narrative is framed in a way that excludes people. It doesn't include them. And unless we correct this fault, we will not build the necessary political will to take up those technologies and to use that capital, however good our analysis is and however hard we try. So I want to steer clear of the detail and begin by looking at really the very big picture of the political challenge that climate change presents. And we need really to understand just how different this problem is from any other problem that humanity has faced, any other problem politics has ever, of any kind, has ever been called upon to deal with. The first difference is this is a problem that is more truly global than any other. The livelihood of literally every single person in every single nation will be affected by a changing climate. Now, in the world we currently live in, far too many people lead lives constrained by poverty, violence, ignorance, and ill health. But they share that planet with others who lead lives that are affluent, peaceful, educated, and healthy. Everyone, for better or worse, will live with the consequences of climate change. Now, this is a characteristic that creates an entanglement of interests unprecedented in history, unprecedented in any of the efforts diplomacy has ever had to meet. And while there might be hard consequences to a failure of climate policy, there are no hard power solutions to the climate problem. You cannot solve this problem by one nation imposing its will on another. Therefore, solving the problem requires an intensity and persistence of cooperation between nations that we have not yet seen, which is why what Hinrich was saying was so important. But cooperation between governments is never one-dimensional, and that means that climate policy success is ultimately predicated on the continuance of a global system where cooperation takes precedence over competition. The second difference is that policy failure is not an option. Now, the development of public policy normally is a very empirical process. We human beings, we learn by doing. We adopt policy measures, then we monitor them for their effectiveness, we review them to take into account changing circumstances, and we revise them if necessary. An economic, social, or political goal that we don't achieve today can be pursued again tomorrow. This is not true for climate change. The long lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a lot of centuries, as you will have heard, means that we are committed irrevocably and in policy terms indefinitely to whatever climate is generated by the carbon burden in the atmosphere at the point of stabilization. If we fail to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level compatible with staying below 2 degrees centigrade, we cannot go back and try again later to achieve that goal. It's no longer available. That runs into the most automatic reflex of all politicians when faced with a truly difficult problem: prevarication. And we cannot, with this issue, afford prevarication, because there is a specific time frame within which action must be taken. The build-up of carbon in the atmosphere is cumulative, it's effectively irreversible, and most governments now accept that a 2-degree rise in global average temperatures is really the boundary between manageable and unmanageable climate change. To remain within that boundary condition, global carbon emissions must peak within the period 2015 to 2020 and decline rapidly thereafter. So you have a fixed time and a fixed point that you have to get to it by, and that really is different. And climate change is going to lead to a complete transformation in the human prospect, and this is true whether climate policy succeeds or whether it fails. If it succeeds, the transformation will take place over the next 30 years. If it fails, the transformation that is already underway will accelerate gradually and become very dramatic in the 30 years after that. The choice is whether events or people drive that transformation. If people make the choice, then over the next 30 years, the way in which energy is used will be transformed. This will bring with it a wide range of co-benefits, I'm sure you've heard about them, both in terms of economic efficiency and human well-being. Food and water security will be maintained. However, the pattern of economic winners and losers will be significantly disrupted. If events drive the transformation, then the global average temperature will rise inexorably and for all practical purposes irreversibly. Food and water security will be undermined, and ever larger numbers of people will be displaced, exposed to conflict, and subject to deeper climate-induced poverty. In those circumstances, preserving the political support for the international institutions that have sustained prosperity and security for billions of people over half a century will become progressively more difficult. And for those people in the health and defense professions, you will be the first responders again, picking up the consequences of that failure. They will fall immediately, and more immediately than almost anyone else, on the health and defense communities. The international negotiations on climate change did not fail in Copenhagen through faults in the process. It's not to say there weren't faults, of course there were. But they really failed because the political will was lacking among the world's leaders. And as we saw ourselves last year in this country with the formation of the coalition, when the political will is there, it really doesn't matter what the processes are. They can be adapted, worked around, or simply ignored if that's what you want to do. Building political will, as Hinrich said, very much is about the conversations that occur in capitals of the key countries around the world, not the conversation that goes on in the negotiating rooms. Tom Spencer pointed that out earlier. International treaties are the output of political agreements, they're not the input to them. The mismatch between the intensity and urgency of the effort required and the perceived remoteness of the threat to everyday life is the major obstacle to our success. Governments everywhere are both distracted and constrained by the current fiscal crisis. They are faced with large and deeply entrenched economic interests, some of which are openly antagonistic to the measures needed to prevent dangerous climate change. The additional cost of making the transition to a carbon-constrained economy are inevitably resisted by businesses and consumers. But more importantly, the scale and urgency and nature of the policy measures required are a poor fit with the core political projects of both the left and the right. For the right, the prospect of higher taxes, more regulation, constraints on personal choice, and a more interventionist government is very hard to swallow. It is no accident that almost all climate deniers are from the right in politics. For the left, the need to put growth at risk, to dislocate existing patterns of employment, and to shift public expenditure from entitlements into investments in a low-carbon infrastructure is equally difficult. That means that we can't rely on our existing political parties to offer voters a clear sight of the choices we must make to preserve our prosperity and security. If we're to deal with this problem, we need a much deeper political analysis on climate change than we've had to date. It needs to be addressing the question of the tension between markets and planning. It needs to address that tension between entitlements and investments. And so far, we've not begun to do that. My own feeling, very strongly, is what it's really going to take politically to solve this problem is an insurgency of the under 40s against the over 40s. We need to shift the axis of politics from a battle between the left and the right to a battle between those who care about the future and those who want to stick in the past. Thank you very much.